Chapter 9. Mother of Methodism. Robert stood with a group of people in front of the foundry and waited for the coach to bring John Wesley's mother to live with him. Two old men chatted near him. "It's a strange thing indeed. He came back from America a failure. He said so himself. Yes, and his brother Charles too." The first man shaded his eyes from the sun and looked down the road. "Not in sight," he announced. "I heard that Mr. Wesley's mother had many a word to say about his going to America." "Indeed, she has said many a word these many a years." The second man chuckled. "Yes, but for a woman they say she speaks right good sense. She should have persuaded her sons to stay in England where they belonged. It was a mistake to try and convert Indians. They are savages. Oxford men should not be busy themselves in such affairs." A third man joined the group. "I knew them. I knew the Wesleys well up there in Epworth. These brothers are not a bit like their father, old Samuel Wesley. He was a preacher too, and mighty strict. Well do I remember back in 1705, standing on the cold floor of his church in my bare feet Sunday after Sunday." "Why did you have to do that?" someone asked. "Some little sin or other, mostly because I spoke up, out of turn you might say." A woman remarked, "I understand that Wesley children didn't get along with the other children there in Epworth." The man from Epworth agreed. "I remember my own parents shouting at them, 'Be off with you, you devil's brats. We'll soon have you out here begging.' 19 children Mrs. Wesley bore, and those that didn't die she taught herself in the kitchen of the parsonage." What would it be like to have a mother around all the time? Robert choked with sudden feeling. Maybe if his mother had lived, things would be different. Maybe he could get to a charity school without loss of pride. He listened to the man from Epworth tell about old Samuel Wesley's poetry. He called himself the island poet of Axholme, even if the island was only a little bit of old England surrounded by rivers and canals. How did he get the church at Epworth? For a poem he'd written for the Queen. He got £50 a year for it, but that didn't keep him out of prison for debt. I remember he owed £300, and this Mr. Pinder wanted the money back in 1 hour. Imagine that. Old Mr. Wesley had used the money just to keep his family going, and he couldn't raise the money in an hour. He would have to sell his furniture and livestock. Well, this Mr. Pinder was going to agree, but some dissenters said Mr. Wesley ought to be put in prison, so they took him to Lincoln and put him in debtor's prison there. A murmur from the onlookers stopped the Epworth man's story. A coach with 4 horses lumbered into view. "It's John Wesley's mother. She's here." Everyone crowded around the coach. A tiny, pale woman with a hooked nose and bright eyes waved through the little window. She leaned back on the seat and closed her eyes. "Is she coming out?" a woman asked. "She's been ill, they say. Has to be carried." John Wesley came around, opened the coach door, and reached in to help his mother. Susanna Wesley put her hand in his, and with a firm step descended from the coach. With a glance as firm as her step, she surveyed the curious onlookers. Robert felt the power of her glance. "So these are the Methodists," Susanna Wesley said. "And you are the mother," someone ventured. Susanna Wesley acknowledged the tribute with a nod and a half-smile. "Sick or not, she's a spunky little woman," Robert heard someone say in a low voice. Mrs. Wesley took command of unloading her boxes. Robert helped carry them upstairs to the apartment. Afterward, he lingered behind, strangely drawn to the little woman, this Mother of Methodism. "Is there anything else I can do for you, Mrs. Wesley?" Susanna Wesley leaned back in a wing chair and folded her hands. "Sit down." She gestured toward an odd-shaped chair with a drawer in the bottom and a flat board backrest. "There, in the drop-leaf chair, or over there in the study chair." The study chair had a most peculiar shape, with a curved back black leather arm at the top, and a bookboard above that. But how could a person sit in the chair and read a book? The backrest was so narrow a person could not sit comfortably. Embarrassed, Robert chose the drop-leaf chair. He could not imagine why a chair wouldn't be made this way. Mrs. Wesley watched him with a slight smile. "What is your name?" "Robert Upton." "Why aren't you in the school my son has started?" I have to learn. I have to earn my living." Robert felt his cheeks flush. Why had he made a stupid mistake as to say learn for earn? What do you do for a living, Robert? Robert described his peddler tray. That's how I met Mr. Wesley. He rushed on, telling how he, his father, and David had kept up with John Wesley's preaching schedule in and around Bristol, yet earned their living all at the same time. David is in school, he finished, but I can't go. Did anyone say you couldn't go to school? Mrs. Wesley's question was soft. No, but... How could he explain? Everything seemed so mixed up all of a sudden. Something inside him kept telling him not to go to school. Whatever it was told him not to worry about being converted. He had enough to do earning his own living. Are you doing what God wants you to do? The question caught Robert unprepared. Wasn't that what he was doing? Listening to his inner voice? It was strange, though, how going to school and being converted had anything to do with each other. Yes, I don't know, he babbled. Susanna Wesley smiled. I think it'll be either the chair you're sitting on or the other one, which is most comfortable. Robert bounced to the edge of the chair. What was she talking about? Robert, I haven't been very well, and I'll need someone like you to run errands for me. My sons, John and Charles, are too busy with their own work to be with me for very long at a time. Do you think you could come by once in a while? Oh, yes, I would like to do that, Mrs. Wesley. But what about the chairs? Susanna Wesley smiled, a secret, almost mischievous smile. Robert thought, what was this mystery of the chairs? He found out soon enough. One day she handed him a book. My eyes are getting so dim. Read me this passage, a favorite of mine. One glance was enough for Robert. He had never seen such squiggles in his life. I can't read that. I don't even know what letters those are. Huh, my children could read their Greek letters by the time they were 8 years old. Mrs. Wesley handed Robert paper and a quill pen. We might as well start today. Start what? Your education. A quick, bright boy like you should not spend his life peddling. She raised a hand to stop his protests. Peddling is certainly an honorable work, but I keep feeling God has something else in mind for you. She gestured to the two mysterious chairs. Take your choice. Try the drop leaf one first. She lowered the drop leaf and it became a writing desk. You sit on the stool facing the chair, she explained. Robert tried it, but the stool was too low for comfort. Try the other one. How do you sit in it? John Wesley smiled. You sit Susanna Wesley smiled. Sit astraddle. So that was the mystery. Robert sat facing the back of the chair. The ledge above the black leather armrest could be used to hold a book or to write on. The chair fit him perfectly. My son John studied this way for many an hour, Mrs. Wesley said. He preferred the drop-leaf chair, however. He is not as large as you. He never weighed more than 126 pounds, even after he was grown. What would it be like to be part of such a big family? Mrs. Wesley described a schoolroom near the kitchen at the rectory at Epworth. When did they start school? Well, they had no lessons until the 5th year, Mrs. Wesley said. The first day they had to learn the alphabet. The second day, the Bible was brought out, and they spelled through the first verse. Robert tried to imagine such fast learning. How could they learn so fast? All my children learned the alphabet in one day. All except one, Mrs. Wesley added in a low voice. They reviewed all they had learned during the morning, and then, before evening prayers, they reviewed the afternoon lessons. Robert gulped. Did Mrs. Wesley expect him to learn the Greek alphabet in one day? He wasn't even sure about the English alphabet. What came after Q, for example? As for the T's and V's, they were simply a buzz in his mind. Why had he bragged to Peter and Sarah back there in Bristol he could read? Just talking to Mrs. Wesley showed him he knew next to nothing. But Mrs. Wesley's patience with him reached his heart. She told him the same thing again and again until it became part of himself. Before he knew quite what happened, he was sitting astride the study chair, studying the lessons in Greek and Latin that Mrs. Wesley had assigned him, and continuing most of the day. How could you be so patient with me? He asked one day. Mrs. Wesley had a faraway look in her eyes. I remember my husband saying to me, "You've told that children the same child 20 times." I told him if I had mentioned the matter only 19 times, my efforts would have failed. It was the 20th time that brought success. She told Robert how she had taught the children to cry softly after the first year, and if they gave each other presents, they could not take them back. They called each other Brother Samuel, Sister Suki, and so on. Were they ever bad? Robert asked. They weren't punished if they confessed, Susanna Wesley said. At the table, they had to eat what was offered and not reach for food. They had to wait for more or whisper to the maid who asked me. From Mrs. Wesley's story about life at Epworth, Robert could almost feel what it was like to live with so many brothers and sisters. Will you go into the other room and bring whatever coins you find from Mr. Wesley's desk? Susanna Wesley asked Robert one day. Robert found the desk with its twin mirrors standing open. He saw notes and letters neatly stacked in a half a dozen desk pigeonholes. Where should he look first? He couldn't paw through all those papers. There must be some mistake about money being in the desk. I couldn't find any money, he apologized to Mrs. Wesley. She pressed her hand to her forehead. I forgot. It's in the secret drawer. Robert went back but could not find anything that looked like a secret drawer. There isn't such a drawer, Mrs. Wesley, he reported. Everything is out in the open. Pull out the drawer on the right-hand side, she instructed. Pull it all the way out and you'll find it. Robert went back and pulled out the drawer. Nothing there. Really embarrassed now, he reported to Mrs. Wesley. When the drawer is clear out, reach in at the side and you'll find a long piece of wood that's loose. Pull it out and on the end you'll see the secret drawer. Robert slid the wooden slat out. At the end was attached the secret drawer, hardly longer than his hand. He brought back the coins. You found it, Mrs. Wesley said. Good. Now I can pay the postman. Mailing letters is expensive, but it's worth it to keep people in touch. Several of Mrs. Wesley's daughters lived not too far away. Robert knew Mrs. Wesley grieved about her son Samuel's death the previous November, but she accepted God's will both in her personal life and the life of the Methodists. Her son was going out to preach more often and further away. Who's in charge of the bands now that John and Charles Wesley are often on the road? Robert heard one of the Methodists ask another. Thomas Maxfield. But he's a layman, isn't he? The other man asked. Yeah, but what does that matter? He's converted. What does he do in the meetings? He reads the scriptures and explains them, that's all. But word spread that Thomas Maxfield, a layman, was preaching. He is inspired, some said. Others sniffed. Kitchen preaching. Robert asked Mrs. Wesley what kitchen preaching meant. Maybe it was something like the kitchen teaching she had done so many years ago. When my husband was away, I had meetings in my kitchen, she told Robert. So many people came they filled the yard clear to the gate. Robert heard others complain. She better not let any kitchen preaching start here. Neither John or Charles Wesley would like it. As everyone soon learned, the Wesley brothers did not like to have a layman preacher, but their mother took matters into her own hands. Thomas Maxfield has turned preacher, I find, Robert heard John Wesley tell his mother on his return from a preaching trip. The little man was as annoyed as he ever permitted himself to be. John, his mother said firmly, you know what my feelings have been. You cannot suspect me of favoring readily anything of this kind. But be careful of how you treat that young man, for he is as surely called of God to preach as you are. Examine the fruits of his preaching, and hear him yourself. John Wesley was fair. He listened to Tom Maxfield's preaching. It is the Lord's doing, he said. Let Thomas Maxfield do what seems good to him. Who am I to withstand God? Robert saw that Mrs. Wesley's son still listened to her advice. To think that she has time to help me, he thought. What had she said? You must not pass through the world like straw upon a river, she had told him. Why had she said that? He was studying hard. Was there something more he had to do?